Good morning, good afternoon, or whenever it is that you're accessing this video. This is the third lesson in our music theory series, which will hopefully allow us to understand music a little bit better and understand the notation that is in front of us. This particular lesson is about whole steps and half steps. Now, this is a lesson that kind of combines the two concepts that we've talked about in the first and second video. So I will encourage you to look at your piano keys sheet, the one that was filled out for the very first lesson, and use it as a reference, because to identify whole steps and half steps, you still need to have a good understanding of the space in between the notes, the way that sheet explains it. So we are going to get started talking about whole steps and half steps. And to do that, I'm going to draw a couple of notes on the staff, basically right on top of each other like a chord. And I'm just going to use naturals for right now, but here we have an F and a G. And in the last lesson, we didn't really need to identify note names, but we do right now. And so this is a treble clef, F and G. And this is a second. We know this just by counting from the bottom note to the top note, just like we did in the second video and for the second lesson. And we know this is a second. Now, seconds come in a few different forms, actually more than just the two that we are about to get into, but we are going to talk about whether or not this second is a whole step or a half step. And we talked about half steps in lesson one with the piano keys. And the question is, in between an F and a G, are they right next to each other on the piano key sheet? Are they right next to each other, or is there a note in between? Is there something that separates them? And if you look at your piano keys sheet, you will see that in between an F and a G, and I guess I'll draw a makeshift piano keys thing right here. In between an F and a G, there is a black key. So since F and G are not right next to each other, since there is a note in between those two, this is what we call a whole step. Again, if you look at your piano key sheet where we talked about half steps, you know that between an F and an F sharp is a half step. Between an F sharp and a G is a half step. And those two half steps next to each other make a whole step. That's another way to look at it. All right. So we are going to go over a few more examples and add some accidentals. It's very important that we understand this with the accidentals that we normally see in the music that we read. So I'm going to draw another note here and another note here. I guess I'll zoom in a little bit more. So treble clef, again, you should know your treble clef notes. We were going to go over those anyway, but this bottom note is a B on the middle line of the staff. And a C is right above it. And the question is, with this particular second, if it is a whole step or a half step, if the notes are right next to each other, or do they have a note in between them? So you check your piano keys sheet. You look at whether there's a note in between B and C, or if they are right next to each other. And hopefully if you've checked that, you notice that they are right next to each other. So between a B and a C, we would call that a half step, which is similar to what we've talked about in lesson one. We'll do one more example without using accidentals. And so here we have an A and a B. And we'll go a little bit faster here and talk about the fact that there is a black key in between A and B. A and B are not right next to each other. So since they have that extra space between them, this is a whole step. So hopefully you understand the concept. We can move on and add some accidentals, which will reinforce this current lesson. First, I'm going to talk about what to expect when you see two notes right on top of each other, which we don't often in band music. The accidental will always be to the left of both notes. And it can get a little bit confusing as to which note this accidental applies to. So, here is the rule. When a note is sharp, you need to look at the middle of the symbol. And if the middle of the symbol is on the space, then the symbol applies to the note on the space. If the middle of the symbol were on the line, then it would apply to the note on the line. That means that this particular sharp symbol applies to the C. We are looking at a B and a C sharp. Similarly, I'll draw two notes here. And here we have a flat symbol. The same rule applies. The middle of the flat symbol, basically the middle of the open section, the B section of the symbol, is on the line. So that flat symbol applies to the note on the line and does not apply to the note on the space. So in the second example, we have a B flat and a C. So now we need to identify the interval here between these two examples. And between a B and a C sharp, if you look at your piano keys sheet, you should see that there is one note in between a B and a C sharp. And once again, I will draw just a small section that we would be looking at on your piano keys sheet. This first note here being a B, the one right next to it is a C, and this black key here would be the C sharp. Since there is one note in between the B and the C sharp, we call this a whole step. Looking at the next example, again, drawing a few more piano keys. The B flat is right below the B. So in between a B flat and a C, there is one note in between. So this is also a whole step. Again, recording a video is very different from sitting in front of a class, and I am hoping that you are catching on with the concept and using your sheet along with along with these videos to understand the concept, but I'm always available for questions, and we're just going to move on with a few more examples. I'll draw two whole notes here with a sharp symbol. Now that sharp symbol is right on the space, not on the line, so we're going to call this an F sharp next to a G. And using your piano keys sheet, you need to think about whether this is a half step or a whole step. The question is whether an F sharp is right next to a G, or if there is a note in between those two. If you're looking at your piano keys sheet, you should realize that no, there are no notes in between F sharp and G. So this is a half step. Another example, I'll go up to the top of the staff here. We have an E flat and an F. And looking at your piano keys sheet, you should look and see if an E flat and an F have any notes in between them. And after looking at the sheet, you should see that there is a note in between them, and E natural is in between those two notes. So we call this a whole step. So this is the concept of whole steps and half steps that hopefully is clear and hopefully will allow you to complete your next assignment and understand this next step in music theory. So go ahead and work on that. Like I said, as we get more and more complicated, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me or contact me on the Band app. But good luck and stay classy.